Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun goes down and hastens to the place where it rises. All streams run to the sea, but the sea is not full. To the place where the streams flow, there they flow again. All things are full of weariness. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. What has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done. And there is nothing new under the sun.
Do you know what it feels like to be empty? Vicki Rose knows what it feels like to be empty.
Gnawing emptiness plagued me through my growing up years.
As a young woman growing up in New York City, she knew something was missing in her life. So she set some goals to try to get that feeling of emptiness to go away.
1, 2, 3. We would go to the hottest disco in New York City at the time was a place called Studio 54. And we'd be ushered into these VIP rooms and I'd see people that I recognized from the movies. We would dance.
But quickly, she discovered this didn't fill her emptiness.
After about 4 months of hard partying, I started to get sick, lost a lot of weight, and realized I couldn't continue being out all night, doing lines of cocaine, and then going to work the next day. That something had to change. 1, 2, 3, 1. Women's Wear Daily is a retail newspaper, and it describes what's going on in the retail industry, but it also has society pages, and it would show women parties they went to, the clothes they wore. And so I was starting to gather the things that I saw all these famous women wear, and it made me feel good for a few days maybe, or a couple of weeks. But somewhere inside I had this sense that just because I had a Rolex watch, it didn't really change the emptiness that I felt.
Vicki got a job as a buyer at Saks Fifth Avenue.
I remember sitting in my office at Saks one day and thinking, I could be president of this store if I work really hard.
But over time, success in business didn't fulfill her either.
I was an empty person selling clothes to other empty people.
Vicki had met a lot of her goals. She'd been successful.
But I still felt that gnawing emptiness.
But Vicki still had one more goal we haven't talked about. Bill Rose came from a well-to-do family and had part ownership of the New York Yankees. Dating Bill seemed like a way for Vicki to get everything she wanted.
This was a life that I had seen on the pages of Women's Wear Daily, and it really drew me and appealed to me.
Bill and Vicki were married in 1977, and very quickly, it became apparent that this wasn't going to fill her emptiness either.
When we were on the plane going to our honeymoon, I looked over, she was asleep, and I thought to myself, what did I just do? In 1984, I got this wonderful idea that I was going to open the best sports bar in the country, and it took off. My life in the sporting club started to spiral out of control. There were women there, and there were drugs there, and I quickly succumbed to both.
The drugs had accelerated. He was at the restaurant all the time.
I would come home at 3, 4 in the morning, pass out, miss the kids going to school in the morning, pretty much, get up around noon and do it all over again.
I was so angry at Billy. I couldn't understand why he wouldn't want to be home with us. Was something wrong with me? Was this going to be forever, that he would never want to be part of our family?
Eventually, Bill moved out, and his life began spiraling out of control.
I had a girl move in with me. There were times I was doing up to 4 grams of coke. I would drink unbelievable amounts of vodka. My life was in a tailspin, and I really should have died.
At this point, Vicki was a busy, working, single mom wondering how to hold everything together. One day, in the middle of the busyness, a piece of mail caught her attention.
On the front hall table was an invitation, a beautiful large invitation in gold lettering, and it said, Mrs. Arthur S. DeMoss invites you to dinner to meet and hear the Secretary of the Interior, Barbara and Donald Hodel, who will talk about Christianity in the world today.
She hadn't had a chance to get dressed up in a while, and this invitation said, black tie.
And I thought, ooh, I'm going. And the speaker's story was so compelling, and they shared that God loved me and had a plan for my life, but that I was separated from God by what the Bible calls sin. Well, I thought sin was just big things like murder, but they explained that sin is anything like worry or envy or gossip, and I knew that I definitely qualified. So they shared that God loved me and had a plan for my life, but that I was separated from Him by that sin, but that the good news is that Jesus Christ was God's only provision for my sin, and that I simply needed to receive Him, and that then my sins, all of them, would be forgiven, past, present, and future, and I would spend all of eternity with God. And that night at that dinner, they offered us an opportunity to pray and ask Jesus into our lives. And that night, November 1987, I prayed and asked Jesus Christ to take over my life and to make me the person that He had created me to be.
For the first time, Vicki knew what it was to have that sense of emptiness filled.
I clearly remember thinking, something has changed.
Vicki was discipled at the DeMoss House, a ministry to people in New York City, and she began reading a children's devotional with her own kids.
One morning, Douglas said, Mommy, we need to pray for Daddy to know Jesus. I said, Douglas, you're right. We need to pray. And I asked all my friends at Bible study, and I asked people at church to pray for Bill Rose to come to know Jesus. And every night before I would tuck Douglas and Courtney into bed, we'd say prayers, and we'd pray for Daddy to come to know Jesus. I noticed that my prayers for Billy started to change, and that my heart was really in them. And so I started to ask God just to make me willing to forgive. I really had no idea how to forgive, but it was a process.
Vicki wanted Bill to hear the same life-changing message she had heard, so she invited him to one of the DeMoss House dinners.
So I went to this Christmas dinner in December of '90, given by Mrs. DeMoss, and there was a guy there speaking, giving his testimony, and just something rung really true. And so it was at that dinner that I prayed to receive Christ.
The kids were ecstatic. We all couldn't believe we were all home under one roof. As days went by, we saw Douglas write a paper for school. He called it the best day ever. It was about coming home from school one afternoon and finding the front hall filled with suitcases because Daddy had come home. And Courtney, as I was tucking her into bed, she said, you know, Mommy, God can do anything. I said, Courtney, you're right, but what do you mean? She said, if God could bring Daddy home, which was never going to happen, He can do anything.
After I came home, things were not perfectly happy ever after. We had our differences, but we just continued to grow.
If married people are honest, every married person would say there are times that they go through hardships, and we're no different. Our marriage isn't perfect. We've experienced so much of God's grace. He's given us our salvation, and He's restored our marriage, but Billy and I are still in process. Thankfully, God's grace is sufficient for us today as it has been all the way through. Growing up in New York City, I had always thought being rich and famous and being in Women's Wear Daily would bring fulfillment. And after all those things had happened, I still was empty. And today, those things may or may not happen, but they're not my goal anymore. My goal each day is, Lord, what do you have for me to do today? Walking the streets of New York and getting on and off buses and taking the subway, God leads me to other women who are in difficult marriages, and it's encouraging to me that He uses me in that way, and I can share the experiences I've had, the emptiness that I used to feel, not knowing what my life was about, not knowing that there was a God who loved me so much. That has been so replaced by joy and purpose to want to please Him every day.